Okay, so welcome to today's Info2Go webinar. My name is Annie Gaines, and I am the Continuing Education Consultant here at the Idaho Commission for Libraries. And on behalf of the Idaho Commission for Libraries and our funder, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Alicia, Kate, and Amanda, who will be speaking to us today about graphic novels. So take it away.
Fantastic. So welcome, everybody. We're going to skip right to the next slide and do a really brief introduction. So Kate is going to be our kind of lovely Vanna White today. So I'm Alicia Abdul. I am a public school librarian in Albany, New York, and have sat on a couple different YELSA committees, but this lovely trio of ladies that we have here speaking, we all met on the 2018 Great Graphic Novel Committee, which kind of has parlayed itself into this presentation, and you'll hear us mention it several times about the AASL presentation that we did last year. So I'm Alicia Abdul. Thank you for having us here today.
And I am Kate Covintree. I work at a private school in Providence, Rhode Island. Alicia didn't say that she is in New York, but she is in upstate New York, where she works at a public school. And so we sort of come at this from both the public and private school perspectives, but both high school. And again, we met at the graphic novel, on the graphic novel committee, and then we haven't stopped liking graphic novels. So we just want to get them into as many people's hands as possible. So Amanda was sort of the one who led us into all of this. My language is hard today, so I apologize to everyone.
It's okay. It's okay. And I'm Amanda Melilli, and the reason why I kind of wrapped everyone into presentations and things is that I'm actually an academic librarian at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I have a really unique position where I run a branch library that is predominantly children's and young adult literature for pre-service and in-service educators. So I approach literature for young people from the classroom perspective, the curriculum, and helping educators find materials to share with their students. So because of that, I have to do a lot of research and presenting, and I just felt that one of the things I get asked about all the time and get asked to come in and teach classes on is graphic novels in education. So so you'll see throughout this, I am more of the theory research side of things, and Alicia and Kate are really the ones on the ground doing the work. So thank you for having us.
And that's why we love Amanda, because she always polishes everything that we do. So real quick, our objectives, and you saw that in the summary before you signed up to attend. So we're going to talk a little bit about the definition for graphic novels, which includes just a few key vocabulary terms. But then we're going to kind of roll into what Amanda was talking about with sharing research, and then giving you some of those practical examples that both Kate and I have worked into our classrooms from our libraries, and then giving you some springboard to next steps and resources. And then we're going to make sure that we keep time well, so that if you have any questions, I think Annie had mentioned at the beginning that she'll kind of keep moderating the chat a little bit. So you know, we'll definitely you know, answer any questions kind of toward the end. So without further delay, we are going to roll into our overview of some of the varieties of graphic novels. And just really talking first about how there is no such thing, if you want to roll one more, Kate, there's no such thing as real reading. And so when we talk about, we have these conversations all the time, and we're still having them, which is hard, but we're going to keep doing this until we don't have to have these conversations anymore. So everybody has a different working definition of what real reading is, but we're coming at it, you know, you can see that second bullet point. You know, we all have a bias that influences our own reading, and we also come at it from how we learned, where we learned, what we learned using. And so we need to focus on the skills being used to read and not what is being read, because like, we want to make sure that when we use the language and we start encouraging more teachers to be able to incorporate them into the classrooms, that we can be that support and we can be that example. And those skills and those vocabulary terms are kind of what we're going to touch on just a little bit. So we absolutely want to make sure that everybody's reading experience is different, but graphic novels are just like a perfect, awesome addition to all of the reading that we already do. And Amanda's going to talk a little bit about that beginning experience as we roll into a couple of our big takeaways for the presentation.
And to add real quick too, maybe not everyone here today is a school librarian or working in a school, but I guarantee you're probably working with parents. I also get things from public librarians who are really frustrated with parents who don't see graphic novels as real reading. So you may not be trying to convince administrators, but you may be trying to convince parents or other things like that. And one thing to think about is that graphic novels are often downplayed because of these pictures and this idea that pictures are cheating. And so whenever I talk to pre-service or in-service educators about graphic novels and this idea of cheating, I always go back to this idea of picture books, right? So on this screen, what you see is you're seeing two uses of text and images. On the left, you have a page from an easy or early reader where it says, I have my backpack and lunch bag too, and it's very clear that the picture is illustrating what the text is saying, right? This isn't very complex. These are books that kids use to begin reading. However, picture books, which are firmly grounded in education, we have awards for them. No one is going to argue that picture books are not quality literature. But they too are using images and text, but it's in a different way. So, and people use picture books at all levels of the curriculum. They use it even in high school. So if we are able to accept picture books as a complex art form for literacy and storytelling and information sharing, there's no reason why we can't also accept graphic novels, because they're doing the same thing. And we need to start shifting our mindset that graphic novels are not cheating like early readers or those early chapter books, right? They are a complex art form like picture books.
And that segues lovely into this big kind of takeaway for us, which is that graphic novels forever and ever are a format, not a genre. And so you'll see, that there are so many different kinds. You've got literary adaptations, like you can see the Anne of Green Gables. You have anthologies, you have fantasy, you have mystery and horror. And so when we come at it from the angle of the format itself and the complexity there, you'll understand that there is just so much to pull from. So whether you're doing reader's advisory in a public library or reader's advisory, always be thinking about graphic novels that can be incorporated. I think one of my favorite ones, First Second, comes out with one of the series, and it's essentially like learning how to cook. And it's in graphic novel format, and it is just, bake like a pro. And it just kind of wraps up this idea that you can learn from so many different things in a graphic novel, as the format is one of those. And then the same thing, we're going to roll into, teachers are using fiction that includes things like drawings, or in the Alumni series, briefing reports. And now we've got a lot more. You've got The Good Girl's Guide to Murder and Sadie that are including, like texts and podcasts. And you've got other ones that are in, epistolary or diary format. So again, if we're talking about the diversity in teachers using different kinds of fiction and incorporating more nonfiction now, why can't we be using graphic novels to do the same thing? So the biggest part of that too, when we talk about that art form and using graphic novels, the last thing that we kind of want to reiterate is that on the page, you see those underrepresented identities. And so Kate's going to slide into this next one. And this was one that we used during this presentation that I think kind of sums up where we're coming from with all of the different complexities, but also that visual format really hitting home. And this was a couple years ago. A student had come up to me in the library and said, I can't remember the name of the graphic novel, but it had a Black girl on the cover. And I said, I don't know which one you're talking about. And I spent 30 seconds pulling from our graphic novel collections of which one that she might have been thinking of. And I think I was both proud of the fact that we represent our community and other communities, but then also an understanding that right there on the front cover or inside the pages, you have these marginalized students, and the visual is there. There's no need to explain or, you know, use a narrative format to put them in the book or on the page. They're seeing it straight up in this format. So I think that that's one of the pieces that is going to be woven in a little bit as we talk a little bit more. And so then we're going to kind of move into really, really briefly some of the vocabulary again that we can use. And Amanda is so much more articulate a lot of the times about kind of getting us set up for some of the vocabulary that we're going to explain.
And I apologize if you can hear my dogs in the background. Literally, UPS just pulled up as I unmuted my mic. So, so once again, talking about that format, right? It's important to understand that graphic novels are kind of their own entity. And they start first with the language that they use. And there is more and more research going to show that this idea of sequential art is actually a language with its own grammar. We have linguistic people who are studying linguistics, like figuring out this grammar and syntax to the sequential art format. So this idea of, you know, you're using juxtaposed images in a sequence to tell a story or share information is sequential art. Not all sequential art is graphic novels or comics, right? You have storyboarding in the film industry that would be considered sequential art. So in our case, the medium that is being used is the comics medium. And this is kind of what we're familiar with, right? The panels, the speech bubbles, things like that. And then that medium uses different formats. You have comic books, which are those little individual issues. You have web comics, which are published online. You have comic strips that used to be a newspaper. I don't know if there are newspapers anymore. But for the sake of educational purposes, when we talk about graphic novels, we're talking about bound volumes of work done in the comic medium. So that could be a bunch of individual comic issues that are published in one volume. It could be a web comic published in one volume. It can also be a completely standalone work that is not published in any other format. So that is kind of the basics that you should know going into this, because that offers a large array of different stories and things like that. And Kate, I think I saw your hand. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject to say that when we talk about graphic novels, the novel is sort of a misnomer in the same way, because it isn't only when people are talking about graphic novels that it has to be fiction that the format is, that a lot of times it's also nonfiction, but for the majority of people, the term graphic novel has sort of come to encompass all of those types of things.
Right. And if you go ahead.
Go ahead, Amanda.
I was going to say, if you use graphic novel within the comic book industry, it's going to have a different meaning than when we as educators and librarians use it. And you can get into the whole history of the term and all of that. But realize that in education and libraries, graphic novel is a bound volume done in a comic medium.
That's exactly what I was going to actually say, Amanda. So when Kate moves to the next slide, first of the few vocabulary terms that we have broken out is the difference between comic and graphic novels. And Amanda just referenced the second kind of part to that comic definition, which is that, you know, comics still refer to the whole medium. And so again, depending on who you're talking to or in what context, you might see a different term, but knowing kind of the basics of those. And so I put up, you know, a comic strip and comic, and then the graphic novel, just as kind of like a way to understand this, because I lovingly passed on all of my Calvin and Hobbes to my sons, and my sons are also super obsessed with Dog Man, and it just gives you that perfect, you know, example of the difference between kind of that narrative told in pictures, but also the long form narrative that we come to know as a graphic novel that is published as that single entity or that volume. And then actually that rolls into Kate, if she wants to move to the next one, this idea that Amanda also referenced about volume versus issue. So you'll see on the left-hand side, you've got Miss Marvel, and that's a volume. And that is a collection of issues that are on the right-hand side. So, you know, if you are a hardcore fan, you're not waiting for a bound volume. You're getting the floppies that are coming out weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, annually. and you're not waiting for that bound issue. But no matter what, that's kind of the difference between the two. And so sometimes it could get confusing to know what you're talking about, but it's good to know, like, issue, £, that's that number. Volume 1 is a collection of £, 1 through 5, or 6 through 12, or whatever it might be. Usually 5, obviously, so I clearly just shared my inadequacies with math. So volume and issue is another one of those pieces that's going to be super important to know the difference. And then that next one is about manga versus anime. And so you'll see on the left-hand side, manga is the comics and the graphic novels that are from Japan. And so that's the print format. It's typically what you know to have to read, you know, backwards, quote unquote. And a lot of them, especially when they're published in the United States, give you that if you're opening up the page, oh, oops, you're in the wrong place and you need to move back, and this is how you read them. But that is the print format. That's what manga is, versus the anime, which is that moving animation. You'll see, you know, in the manga, it's typically black and white. In the anime, this is Little Witch Academia, and that's a still from that visual format. So again, the difference, and I think a lot of the times too, sometimes it's a conversation piece, but sometimes, and not knowing, and sometimes it's more of that genre. A lot of people use anime as that catch-all term because they feel awkward saying the word manga, I don't know. But anime is simply just that moving animation, that visual format. And then the last one is one that, again, if you're talking about teaching it or you're understanding what's happening in the story itself, you've got the difference between kind of captions and speech bubbles. And so you've got a couple of the ones on the bottom that show different meaning based on how the actual bubble is organized, but usually, you know, has the tail. But we were actually, Amanda was just, when we were talking a little bit more about this presentation too, the fact that most manga does not include the tail of the speech bubble. And so that is that extra layer of understanding as you practice and get better about reading manga, if it's not a typical thing that you read, to understand who is the one speaking if the tail is not associated with a specific character in the story. But the captions usually are containing that information about what's happening in the scene between characters versus the dialogue that is the speech bubble itself. So again, just simple. We could spend, you know, a lot of time breaking it down, and there are so many great books that do that work for you to be able to explain all of those intricate details if you truly want to have all of the vocabulary. But those are just some of the main ones.
Okay, so I'm going to try not to bore you with all this. So I'm going to share a little bit about some of the research on graphic novels and why they're complex and why they should be used with young people. So the first slide we're going to look at, I have Kate, there we go. Okay, when we talk about graphic novels, there's this misnomer that they're easy because there's not a lot of words and there's a lot of images, right? And we touched on this a bit in earlier. But to read a graphic novel actually requires a very large skill set. You have what we're going to call reading literacy, right? All the things that readers have to do in order to understand the words. With young children, this is learning sight words, this is learning sentence structure. And then as you get older, it's all the way up to like character development, themes, text and subtext, all of those type of things. Then you have visual literacy. And so I would say like a picture book deals with reading literacy and visual literacy. If we went back to that other image that we did before, which you don't have to do, Kate, you would be able to analyze the words and then also be able to look at the symbolism in the artwork, look at the color tones, all of those type of things to analyze the images and words together. Comic literacy is a whole new layer, because remember, when we're talking about graphic novels, we're talking about them being written in the comics medium. So as Alicia pointed out before, understanding captions, if you're not familiar with manga, you're not necessarily going to have an easy time understanding the speech bubbles or the captions that just seem to be floating randomly across the page. There's different cultural things that you have to know between reading, you know, Western comics versus Japanese comics. And then there's different things like Eminata or Kiyu or you know, text or image-based sound effects are on you, depending on if you're talking US graphic novels versus Japanese. And these could be things like the light bulb that appears over someone's head, right? That does not have any intrinsic meaning whatsoever. That is something that we learn, that a light bulb over someone's head means they have an idea. We can look at how sound is portrayed in the comic format. Like maybe you have a drum and there's little lines coming off of it, so you know they're hitting the drum lightly. But if they have big lines coming off of it, then you know they're really pounding on the drum. And across all three of these skill sets, these literacies, the reader has to combine all of them and then infer what's happening in the text. So Kate, if you want to go to the next slide. And this is what I find very interesting about the research, is we know that like reading literacy is developed with age and experience, right? Little kids can't, you know, track a lot of things across the page. You know, they use their fingers to trace things until all that muscle development happens. We know that there's this combination of the brain developing and learning things and being exposed. The research on comic literacy is showing that exposure and experience plays a predominant role. So you can have a early elementary school kid who has never read a graphic novel before and an adult who has never read a graphic novel before, and they're both going to struggle with understanding it because that comic literacy component is developed through the experience of reading. To show some of this complexity, we're going to look at some examples of these merged literacies. So the first panel that you see on the left, I always find very interesting because there's no words, right? But it's a very powerful page. And yet, we know that the young man in this is getting shot by the bullet. But what's interesting is we never see the bullet or the young man in the same panel in the same place. In fact, we don't even see them with the same background. But somehow you know that the bullet and the young man are linked, and it builds up to this dramatic moment. You don't have to see the room that this is happening in. You don't have to see the young man here and the bullets here, and it's getting closer and closer and closer and closer, because you're using that visual literacy and comic literacy to combine into inferring what is happening in this scene. The other example we have on the right is we don't ever see the characters. And this is an example of what Alicia said earlier about there's no tails on the speech bubbles. This is actually 3 different people talking. And a reader of this manga is going to know exactly who's saying what if they have literacy in manga. And you're going to know what the characters are doing, even though you're not seeing them. And so we know by the darkened house with a little bit of light in the family room or that communal room on the first floor, that everyone's hanging out together talking about what they're going to do the next day, and that they have to go to bed early. And then you see a night sky, and then you see a closed bedroom door, and then you see a clock saying 1 o'clock. And we don't ever see these characters, but in the mind of someone who's comic literate, they're picturing these characters sleeping. So a lot of you know, combining everything to develop that image in your head. Another example on the left is you're actually the reader is focusing on 2 scenes at the same time. So we're visually seeing these 2 young lovers who we could break this down about all the meaning that is coming through in the images. The young girl is kind of startled in that middle panel, and then she kind of eases into, you know, being with the person that she has a crush on, but she's still slightly embarrassed. And the young man, you can tell he's embarrassed. You're seeing the back of him. His shoulders are kind of hunched, his head's kind of ducked, and his hands kind of behind him, right? So you're reading all these emotions of these 2 characters without words. But then the words in the speech bubbles are actually happening in a completely different location with a completely other set of characters. So the readers have to follow both of these scenes at the same time. I also really like the image on the right because this shows you how the graphic novel format and comic medium can be used to show a whole bunch of things happening all at once. So this is all one panel. And people unfamiliar with graphic novels may think that that's one snapshot in time. But actually what's happening in this panel is you're seeing hours worth of one party. And in order to fully understand this, you have to know that the young woman with kind of the curls in her hair and her glasses is seen multiple times throughout the scene. She's not a twin. The baby is seen multiple times across the scene. The dog is seen multiple times across the scene, right? And so the reader knows or can infer that this is one party happening over a couple hours in one panel. So it's a pretty complex way of using images and words. And I think we have one more set of examples. Okay, so the one on the left is from the Diary of Anne Frank, the graphic novel version. And in this case, the first panel is what's happening in reality, right? Anne walks into the room, she finds out that her sister has been called up, and then the next panel immediately switches to Anne's imagination. So now the readers aren't even in like a physical setting. There's nothing that says Anne's imagination, right? We kind of think about that in the old like Batman-y type comics, like in a villain's lair somewhere, right? We don't really do that stuff anymore when we do comic storytelling. The reader has to infer that information. And so in this case, the reader has to infer that, you know, Margot is not actually on a train to a concentration camp, but this is what's happening in Anne's mind. And then the last one kind of goes back to that cultural comic fluency. Just because you read comics in the US does not mean you're going to be able to pick up a manga and know what's happening. As Alicia said before, these are read most of the time if they're printed in their traditional format, they're read from right to left, top to bottom. You'll notice in this panel, the characters are drawn differently, like they physically look different. Sometimes they're round and bubbly, and sometimes they're more like themselves. The last panel is one of the things that is so extremely crucial to understanding this page is that little star. Because what the character looks very solemn and clear, but that little star is representing that in his mind, he's like, yeah, I won that debate, I won that argument. But if you're not familiar with manga storytelling, you're not going to pick up on that stuff, and your readers are going to be really confused. So never start a new reader to graphic novels on manga. It can be very confusing. So this is an exercise that I use with my students to show kind of the complexity of this type of storytelling. And normally I have us read through this and we do this activity, but we don't have time for that and we're virtual, so I'm just going to kind of explain it. This is one page, 4 panels from volume 2 of Monstrous. And in this one page, we can figure out a whole lot of things. So there's a lot on world building. We know that there's issues between these animal people and humans. We know that there are race issues between the water arcanics versus the land arcanics. We know that there are these things called necromancers that can enslave souls and that they look like cats, and the more tails they have, the more powerful these necromancers are. So you learn all of that just from 4 panels. You also do quite a bit of character development. You get a really good idea of who that little fox character Kippa is, this fun and excited little person who just wants to see the good in everything. You learn about the necromancer Ren, who for some reason seems grouchy with Kippa, but tolerates her, you know, showing kind of this older brother type thing. And then, you know, Miss, the female character at the bottom, is just kind of like this really cool, like hardcore person, even though she only has 1 line. And so I always say, like, on this page, depending on how you analyze it, you can have I think my students have decided on 4 to 6 conversations happening in just these 4 panels. And we're able to experience that many conversations without getting confused, and because of the visual nature of the graphic novels. If you were to try to write this scene in prose, it would take pages and pages and pages and pages. But because we're following Kippa, the little fox character, around the ship, we are actually just kind of eavesdropping on everything that she's hearing, and you can go from one conversation to the next without being confused. And then one thing that I always kind of get pushback on is that this idea that, you know, people say that because you're giving the graphic images, kids aren't, you know, creating the visuals in their head. And I always push back with, you know, when a writer is writing a young adult book or something like that, they're not telling you every single detail in the room. And you know, the readers have to picture it all together. And the same thing is with graphic novels. We never see this entire ship. We never see the entire deck. But every time I go over those with my students, when I ask them, what did you see in your head? They said, we saw an entire boat, an entire deck, and they fill in the parts just in the same way as you would with prose. So to make this a little bit more visual, all of these colored circles represent different points of information, whether they're words or they're images. And all of that combines together to give you all that information in a very small package. And that's really the power of graphic novels, because they're a complex storytelling, information sharing format without taking up a ton of space. And so it's important to know that although there aren't a lot of words, the combination of the words and images gives readers a ton of information.
And I'll add, Amanda, as Kate segues into the next one, that I think I will never actually read The Hobbit in print, but reading the graphic novel, I don't know, 15 years ago was all I really needed. I didn't have the patience and didn't really have the ambition to want to sit with The Hobbit, and the graphic novel gave me the context that I needed, the visual that I wasn't going to build in my head. So that definitely helps. And, one of the things that we'll maybe mention a little bit later too, we have a lot of English as a new language learner students in our school. And I always try to find some kind of graphic format of these books. And there's some really great, there's the manga classic versions and some others that sometimes are just that little push that they need to be able to understand some of the extras.
And that segues great into the research. Okay, so the research shows this to be a complex form of information sharing. But it also shows that students who read graphic novels have equal or greater text comprehension than reading the traditional prose. Graphic novels, I hope you all know, increases reading motivation. Someone put that in the chat earlier, that it's this good bridge for literacy. It's also showing to increase content area literacy, which is super important, like especially with all the push for the Common Core and getting college ready, like this idea of different literacies in different subject areas is huge. And studies have also shown that students who read a subject in a graphic novel form are actually more eager to go and find additional other forms of information on that same topic afterwards. So if you had a graphic novel like March, students may all of a sudden want to go look for some nonfiction or fictional prose related to that topic.
I love that was the graphic novel that I just thought of as you were talking. I was like, March.
And I would also add that one of the other things that it allows in terms of visual literacy is that, for example, that one image of everyone being in that party at the same time, there are Renaissance paintings that follow that same sort of timeline of doing this cyclical sort of narrative within a painting. And if students become familiar with it within a graphic novel, it can actually be a way for them to understand how to read more complex paintings as well. And those types of art forms that they are not necessarily aware that they're using those same skills and techniques. We've ended up saying, oh, have you ever read a comic that tells you a lot on a page? This is the same kind of thing, but just done in the 1500s.
Yeah, and this doesn't come up in this presentation because I focus mostly on education, but we do work with, at the university level, some art illustration courses that use graphic novels for that very reason, as, a way of expanding the conversation about art and all of the things that go with art, which is not my forte, but yeah. So we can get into a little bit more of the particulars. So graphic novels are really, really good at leveling the reading field, okay? And they're good for all sorts of readers. Like I get asked all the time, like, like we have donors and they're like, I really want to do a collection that helps with English language learners, or I really want to do a collection that helps with, students who are struggling to read or things like that. And I always say, we have that collection. It's just not labeled as that because it works for everyone. So graphic novels are a really quick reading experience that allows you to cover a lot of ground. So in the time that it could take a student to read a young adult novel, they could have read 3 to 5 graphic novels from different perspectives. Once again, that content area vocabulary building, lots of research showing that if you introduce a topic in a graphic novel form before moving into like the textbook or something like that, the students have better vocabulary to talk about what they're learning. I love the studies that are done on classic literature. So this idea of increasing comprehension. So there's some studies done where they've given students some Edgar Allan Poe text in prose and some in graphic novels, so the same words. But the students who get in the graphic novel actually do better on the comprehension test than those who did it in prose, because the context is so unfamiliar to our students. This is why I always advocate for the new Anne Frank graphic novel, because it gives this visual context that your students would not be able to have in their heads without it, and it allows them to understand the text that much more better. And as Alicia said earlier, underrepresented voices. This is before the whole we need diverse books movement, like there have been venues for, through webcomics and all those things for underrepresented voices to use this medium, more so than I would think in prose. More specifically, we've touched on this, English language learners, undiscovered readers, that's the preferred term we like, instead of struggling or reluctant readers, because we have the philosophy that everyone's a reader, they just haven't discovered what they like to read yet. And students with disability. This is where the playing field really gets leveled. If you have a lot of students, you can have the lowest readers in your class, the highest readers in your class, your English proficient, your English non-proficient students, all reading the same text at the same time. Graphic novels are less intimidating. Same reason why people think they're not complex. There's less words, more images, but that actually makes them less intimidating to readers who are easily intimidated by a lot of words. A really important part is they can be developmentally appropriate. So you're not handing that undiscovered reader who's reading 3 grades below reading level a baby book, right? For people who maybe struggle with visual context or facial expressions, seeing those characters on the page help them decipher things instead of having to create the image in their head from prose and then kind of this back and forth. And what I think is really important is this community building concept, right? I'm currently working on a paper for library collections for English language learners, and one of the things that keeps coming up is this need to be able to socialize and engage with what they're learning with the the students who are native English speakers, right? Instead of othering them. And so if you have, Dog Man, and everyone can read Dog Man for the most part, all of a sudden it gives these students something to talk about and engage with. Very similar to how maker spaces kind of do that too. And then the more graphic novels you read, the more your confidence builds, the more your reading endurance builds. So as someone said earlier, it's this really good bridge to trusting in reading. And then the use of literary adaptations is great. Someone is not understanding Romeo and Juliet in the classroom, you give them the manga version that has the same text, but it's got the images and it just is not as overwhelming. So a lot of good, we could go on forever about the research, but I'm going to hand it over to Kate now.
No, I was muted that whole time and then I unmuted. Okay, sorry, technical difficulties. So I'm going to really be showing just 3 good examples that we have of in-classroom use, and my colleagues earlier already spilled one of mine, I think unintentionally. But so 2 of them are ones that have happened at my school that I've been involved in, and Alicia's going to interject with one that she's done at her school. And the reason that we chose these 3 in particular is because the library was integral in making sure that these were collaborations and that they weren't just the teacher finding a graphic novel and using it for instruction purposes, but we found ways to collaborate with those teachers. So sort of to follow with Amanda's point to begin with, one of the teachers at my school teaches Watchmen, and he says that it actually seems to reignite an interest in reading almost precisely because students feel that they're not reading a typical English class book. And in that book, he really uses Watchmen just as the text in and of itself. He doesn't put it with something else or anything like that. He just has them read that and spend a really good, strong amount of time. They also read Kindred in that class. And so I'm constantly trying to get him to use the graphic novel of Kindred in that class because that to me is one of those graphic novels. Some I think can be really excellent replacements for the novel itself or for the original text. And some, I think this about Kindred, almost become supplements to the original so that you read it and then you actually want to read the real, like the original book to begin with. How do you use graphic novels in your classroom? You use them the same way you use any other book in a classroom. So you can use it for literary criticism, exploration of themes, topic scaffolding, writing style. You can use it to explore any other thing that you're doing within your school or within your curriculum. Within our schools in New York and Rhode Island, these are just some of the books that Alicia and I have either worked with teachers or students with or gotten other teachers or students to sort of work with. We've had author visits and electives and faculty book clubs, summer reading, world history classes, health classes, constantly trying to incorporate different graphic novels in different ways. As an aside, On a Sunbeam is one of ours for summer reading, and spoiler alert, there are no male characters in that book really. And so I was asking, we have choice for summer reading. So I was asking a student who read it, I said, oh, what did you think? And she was like, oh, it was okay. And I said, well, didn't you think it was kind of cool that there were no male characters? And she was like, yeah. And then a boy who had read Lord of the Flies over the summer said, huh? And he said, I wonder if there are any books where there are no female, no female characters. And I was like, you just read Lord of the Flies. Like there are lots of those. So, so it can be a really great way to have these conversations about equity that you don't even realize, or that students don't even realize are happening within their reading lives. So one of those, the first example I'm going to share is just Hyperbole and a Half. And this is used in a memoir class, and the teacher really brings in graphic novels in a whole bunch of ways. And the way that I get usually involved into the class is that they have a chance to actually look at some of the other graphic novels in our collection, other memoirs in our collection, and sort of do a book tasting where they can see just how varied the memoir, graphic novel memoir can be in terms of those things. But they also just look at Brosh's visual expressions and her style. And for a lot of the students, her crude drawings sort of help bring out the emotive aspects of the book itself, and also show this expressiveness and the humor. And the teacher really thinks that it helps them with their critical thinking and brings them closer to these tough topics that she's talking about within the book. Alicia, you want to talk about photographic?
So this was an example I worked with the photography teacher last year, and it will now be embedded in the curriculum from here on out. So this is one I kicked myself for not having read it the year it came out. And when I did, I stopped immediately that weekend, and I walked it into her classroom on Monday morning, and I said, you need to read this. I don't know where this fits in your curriculum yet, but it will. And she read it the next day and said, I absolutely know where this is going to fit. And so she does an identity unit, and photographic is the life of Graciela Iturbide. And so it is a beautiful kind of example, and Graciela still lives. So there was some really great kind of connections with Getty Images that helped produce the book. And so what I love about this one is that Isabel Quintero and Zeke Pena are the author illustrator. And so Quintero did the biography and Pena did the illustrations. And if you get a chance, I'll challenge you to pick up photographic, because what Pena does is he actually, and here's the example, So this was Graciella's photograph on the left. And so Pena takes it, and not necessarily in the same few pages or panels, he then recreates that image. So one of the things that didn't end up happening this year that is hopefully going to happen is that we are going to actually team the photography students up with our AP art class and have the AP kids take a photograph from the photography students and do that recreation. So that didn't happen this year, but that's one of the pieces that we're going to aim for. So regardless, the important pieces of what we incorporated was that we took the identity unit, that they were doing self-images, they were doing street photography, they were doing they were doing a portrait, they were doing, there were 6 total that they worked with. And so we were able to incorporate some of the with journal prompts and discussion elements, the critiques of the students doing their photography work alongside of what was happening in the book itself. So we were analyzing some of the pages, we were talking about the artist statements, we were incorporating all of the things that she was already doing in class with more about how this graphic novel created a larger than life kind of image of who Graciella was and inspired her to really kind of come into her identity, and then use that to springboard to talk about students, their identity, and then also kind of their artistic identity. And so we had a lot of really rich discussions that were just another way to incorporate learning about a person that they didn't cover in class, but then also appreciating this format and the artwork that came along with it. And so Diana, who was the teacher, talked about how impactful the story was, and actually some of Graciella's story is actually a mirror to what the teacher's story was. So I knew it was speaking to her on another level, and for a lot of the students and their feedback, it spoke to them on a deeper level, especially in seeing who they were. That underrepresented voice that we talked about a few different times is again present in how we were able to incorporate this one into the classroom.
And our third example is one that I was able to do this summer. We had a sort of untraditional summer term that we offered to people due to these strange, uncertain circumstances we're all experiencing right now. And so for 6 classes over 3 weeks, twice a week, just for an hour, I met with a few students who had signed up, and they each read a different graphic nonfiction book. So I offered 4, and there were 3 that were chosen: Brazen, March, book 1, and They Called Us Enemy, which is George Takei's memoir of his time in an internment camp for Japanese citizens in the US. And really the question that guided us throughout the term was, how does the graphic novel format impact your understanding of the factual information presented? And so what was great about doing this was that I was really able to not only teach them some of the comic literacy that we do in this presentation, but also look at the experiences that were inside these books and compare them to the experiences that they could discover inside of primary sources. And so give them the opportunity to analyze the primary sources and compare the representations of those facts with the events as they're perceived. And they all sort of presented in different ways. The image that you see on the left is Nellie Bly, is a quote that the student found about Nellie Bly, saying that she realized if she had staring eyes and opened them as wide as possible, then people would think that she was crazy. And when you look at the image from the comic or from the graphic novel, her eyes are as big as the author, as the illustrator, can make them. And so clearly the illustrator had to have done some work in terms of finding those things out. And one of the things I found most interesting was that the pieces that would sort of connect to me on the graphic novels, especially with the nonfiction texts that I've read, are not necessarily the pieces that the students connect to. So, and it did pursue some of our students to find out more information. So the student who read March, it made her realize that there were ways in which she tended to gloss over extremely famous events. She had never fully read the I Have a Dream speech, even though you know, she knows the beginning of it. She never read all of it. And so it made her really read that whole speech. And of course, in March Book 1, the I Have a Dream speech is so small, like it's one small piece of this whole large narrative that gets talked about. But there were all these moments throughout history that are mentioned in that book that just gave so many opportunities for her to really explore and to find out more information that was new to her and new in a way that I think was surprising and unexpected. And so one of the things she found was that Nate Powell's illustration of the SNCC practices almost directly mirrors a photo of those same practices, which is what you see in this image. So there are lots of curricular options that you can use within schools. Most of ours in our examples tend to go towards older ages, but certainly the science comics can be great for so many, and The Secret Coders is a great series if you want to help people learn how to do coding. But it isn't just March, it isn't just They Called Us Enemy, it isn't just Mouse. There are so many options, and they don't have to just be in history classes, though there are certainly a lot of things within history classes. Right now, we ourselves have our own favorite picks that we think should go into classrooms. So my favorite right now are Through the Woods, which is an oldie but goodie. Emily Carroll is just so, her stories are just so creepy and her illustrations are so amazing. And the last story in this book is just the stuff that nightmares are made of, but in the best way, Kiss Number 8 is a great story about relationships and identity and sort of figuring out who you are. And Springtime in Chernobyl is what I'm currently reading, so that gets to go up there. And it's really about the world that is happening around Chernobyl based on the nuclear meltdown. So those are my three. Alicia, do you want to share yours?
Yes, and in the interest of time, I will pick the one of my three. Witch Hat Atelier is my new super big obsession. Amanda's giving me the thumbs up. I have to own all of them because they're lovely. It is teamwork, it is magic, it is believing in yourself, it is hard work. It's all of those things together, and it is so accessible for upper elementary, middle grade, and clearly I'm an adult and super obsessed with it myself.
Yeah, I will just say that I am in a COVID reading book swap group with a 3rd and 5th grader for that series. So yes, it's so good. It's so good. My top picks, I mentioned Anne Frank's Diary before, and I think pairing that with Belonging, which is a memoir of a woman growing up the generation after the Holocaust and Nazi occupation and coming to terms with that, and what does it mean, like how involved was her family and things. And when she goes to the US, she's looked at one way, she goes to Germany, she's looked at another way, she goes to parts of Europe. And so I think if you were to combine the two, they would make this really nice way, kind of like what Kate was saying her student said, where we tend to simplify these things. And then I always promote this place. It's an anthology of you know, the history of Indigenous people, written by Indigenous people, and it, you know, it's their take on trying to get their voices out there, and it's this huge, beautiful graphic novel that has these voices that you wouldn't hear anywhere else. So if you're ever going to be talking about the Native American experience, you need to be pulling in some of these graphic novels written by these people, because you're not going to get those voices in a textbook. You're not necessarily going to get them in prose, and there's a lot of momentum, you know, using that with something like Not Your Indian Princess or The Code Talkers would be really powerful as well.
And just to sort of reiterate, the pairing of Belonging with Anne Frank's Diary would be so amazing. Alicia's top pick is called Witch Hat Atelier. It's this one right here, this cute little one right here. It's a manga, and certainly reading manga, as Amanda mentioned earlier, is a certain, there are certain things that you have to get used to, and some of them are easier than others. Alicia and Amanda, is that an entry level? It is an entry level manga. They're not all entry level. I am one of those people that they had during when we were on that committee, there were some graphic novels that some manga I should not have started with because it was not entry level, and I was an entry level manga reader at the time. But this is the challenge that we want to give you, and this is sort of what I'm talking about. We have to make it work for you. Those are the things that we love right now, but it changes because we read a lot. And what you have to do is become an expert reader. There is no perfect book for one, there's no one graphic novel fits all. And so the best way to develop your reading fluency is to read it. Make a goal of reading 25 graphic novels in the next 6 months. Maybe you want to make it in the next month. You can make that goal however you want. You can do Alicia's of 1 graphic novel a day until we find a vaccine. However you want to do that. But when you do that, if you're a beginner, you want to build your own comic fluency. So what do you enjoy reading? What genres do you enjoy? What manga can you, really enjoy, and what manga do you have to put over to the side because it's way too disturbing? And then, like figure out what you enjoy if you're a beginner reader. If you're an advanced reader, then think about what's going to work for your classroom or for your library, for your readers, for your patrons. Who are the ages that you're dealing with, and what are the needs that they have, both the students and the teachers, and what kind of purpose could this bring into the work that you are already doing? And then you want to select your graphic discovery sources. Booklist in July had a huge feature that you could look at that. You could look at the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable. They're doing a huge event in 2 days with Jennings, who is the author of the book that Amanda was talking about with the shooting. Lib Comics Online is happening, I believe, all year. And so there are lots of different resources that you can take a look at. And I know that we're just giving you some of what's available. And then you're going to build your reading list. So if you are a beginner, if you don't like a book, you get to put it down because you're figuring out what you like. But if you're an advanced reader and you don't like a book, you have to figure out, is it because you don't like the book or because the book isn't any good? And based on that, that's how you get to decide if you have to, sometimes you just have to read it anyway. Or you get to, put it down. So you're going to really select titles based on the needs of your users, not as much based on your own preferences. And then you're going to use that expertise to put graphic novels into your collection, to get those graphic novels into your reading groups or into your small discussions or into your classes, or into your little free libraries on the side of the road. They can be all school reads, they can be free reading, they can be bibliotherapeutic, they can be in the classroom, however that's going to work for you. Finally, our takeaways are, that if you don't remember anything else, try to remember these few things. So it's a valid and complex learning tool. It's a format, not a genre. It's a medium for sharing information across literary genres. And it merges literacies, and in fact, sort of creates a third literacy that we often don't think about in the process of dealing with 2 other, reading literacy, visual literacy, and then also comic literacy. And it's oftentimes a great hook for learners. It's a way to get them to reignite that reading and that joy of it that they may have forgotten, and grasp emotionally or intellectually complex materials. But you want to remember to think about what your readers need. So there's no perfect graphic novel for every classroom. And just because a book is about the Holocaust and you're studying the Holocaust doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right graphic novel about the Holocaust to bring into your classroom. So you want to make sure that you've done your due diligence in terms of those vettings, but there are lots to choose from, and it's really worth the effort. So I don't think any of us would say that we don't love it. We came to it in different ways, but we keep reading them, and it's so worth the effort, and we love it. So we've also referenced all of our graphic novels here and our sources. And any questions? Trying to be quick because I realize we're at the end.
So there was one question in the chat I was sort of saving until the end here. They asked, if you were to choose a graphic novel for an adult book club, which one would you choose, with mostly traditional readers but who are open-minded to new things?
But good talk.
Yeah, and I put in the chat, which Annie actually fixed for me. Memoirs is a good place to start in general. especially if you have adults who aren't really into youth lit. Memoirs tends to be a familiar genre, and you can always typically find someone that's interesting that you may not have known about. Alicia, you had a specific.
I just dropped in Good Talk by Mira Jacob is perfect, I think. And then another one that just hit me in the feels like crazy is In Waves. It kind of marries surfing history and surfing culture with the death of a loved one and kind of like lost romance. The imagery is spot on and perfect in so many ways. So I would say In Waves is my other one.
And I would even go with Belonging, which was, because that in some ways it's not a very graphic novel. It's a little bit more like a scrapbook. So it's more like their occasional, and I think it's a really great way of rethinking the German experience after World War II in a way that most history classes aren't covering. Good. So I think, and those are a little more recently published than something like Fun Home or Mouse, which might be the first ones you would think of. I agree that starting with like a memoir or a current event kind of a thing can be a really interesting way to access graphic novels. There was another question, Annie?
Yep. How do you explain graphic novels to parents who do not believe or know what they're about?
Amanda.
So you gotta start with the fact that it's a format. So if you know the parent at all, so my way of persuading anyone to do anything is to find their currency. What is it that they will jump on board for? So if you know kind of like maybe what the parent wants their kids reading, like maybe they want their kids reading STEM stuff, you can talk about how there are things like Cells at Work that describes the human body and is scientifically accurate, but your kid's gonna want to read it. Like the problem with parents is the same thing with administrators and a lot of teachers, is this, once again, this lack of comic literacy and this lack of understanding that it's a format. So as you start teaching people that any book that exists out there, any literary genre can exist in a graphic novel format. What would you like your child to know more about? What would you like your child to read? Track down a graphic novel based on that and be like, look, I know you're interested in your child learning more about, the civil rights movement. Here, have them read March. It's great. Talking about awards or, graphic novels are winning literary prizes all over the place. And so I think kind of the myths that we talked about is something that you need to start actually articulating to people and understanding you may only get an elevator speech. So having an elevator speech on different topics and different currencies to parents. Most of the time is they want their kids reading. Most of the time it's, they don't want them spent. I ran into someone in the College of Ed in Barnes & Noble, and I heard them saying, no, you can't buy a graphic novel. You have enough graphic novels. You need to go buy a regular book. And I was like, no, I have not done my job as a librarian.
But I think that's the piece to it is using that articulation and I like what you said, Amanda, about using the currency, because we do a nonfiction project with our AP language teacher, and it's a very extensive, involved project. My favorite book talking because it's all nonfiction. And over the last few years, I finally was like, you know what, like there was always a little bit of conversation about it. And then finally I was like, you know what, we're having this moment where I'm going to explain to you why it doesn't matter whether it is in graphic format or not, because the same elements are going to be there for the student to be able to use for the project. And so I think it's been 3 years, and there are students who select graphic novel nonfiction for their AP language project.
And that sort of also makes me think that Amanda's, if I remember correctly, based on something else that she shared, she sort of challenges her library sort of has a policy of always putting at least one LGBTQ book in whatever book display they're doing for whatever topic it is, sort of to remind people of the fact that it isn't a one, 1 month type of a thing. And I think you could do that with books about diversity. I think you could do that about a lot of things, but you could also do that by saying, we want to make sure that it's always a multi-format display. And so we always want to have at least one graphic novel that we can, as much as possible, that we put out there so that people understand that graphic novels aren't just Batman and they aren't just Mouse, but that there's this whole variety that somebody could find something that fits for them. But I also think that that's, one of those pieces that has to do with, broadening that idea of reading overall. So thinking about reading a blog as still legitimizing reading, or thinking about reading the newspaper online as still legitimizing reading. There are all these ways that people are reading all of the time that we don't necessarily credit them for actually reading. So I think that's the other piece of it.
Parents are going to expect their kids to be educated in the way they were educated. And if we don't change this idea that we need to improve the educational process, it's fine. You got a great education. You're not dumb, but there are way more opportunities now for improvement for your child, and it's going to look really different than what you learned. That's an uncomfortable thing for a lot of parents.
Awesome. Well, I feel like we've had a really great presentation and conversation. Thank you three so much for coming today and presenting. I'm going to stop recording for now.